questions, so we'll see what we can do this morning. As was said, I'm Sandra Brown from IPv4 Market Group, and I'm going to talk this morning about the transfer market in Asia. Okay, 4 topics on the agenda. First, an introduction, and then I'm going to talk about the purchase process, which is how a company would go about acquiring IPv4 addresses. Then I'll speak to the year in review, 2014 in review, what happened in the APNIC region in terms of IPv4 transfers. And lastly, I'll close with some outlook statements on 2015. So first of all, IPv4 address transfers. This is a pretty new market. It's very young. And it began back in 2011 with the famous now Nortel Microsoft transfer where about, I think it was 9/16s were transferred from Nortel to Microsoft. And the price at that time in that transaction was publicly known at $11.25 an IP. And as you'll see in some of my slides that follow, prices have fallen since that initial transfer. It's kind of like nobody knew what the price should be, and submissions were made, nobody knew how many IPs would come to market, and supply and demand wasn't known, so initial price was set at $11.25, and you're going to see that prices have since fallen. In the past year, we've seen that the RIPE NCC, and there's a couple of RIPE guys in the room today, RIPE NCC is the most robust trading region. They do a pile of transfers every month compared to the other 2 regions, partly because ARIN hasn't run out of IPs yet, where companies can go to ARIN and get free allocations. ARIN has about 0.3/8s available as of yesterday to give out, and partly because the APNIC marketplace is a little bit slower in terms of companies requesting transfers. All the regions publish the transfer data, so all transfers are publicly viewable to see who's getting what IPs from what companies and in what volume. The only thing not visible is the price. So some of the pricing data I'm going to talk to today is based on my company's experience in the marketplace. And really, the stuff we publish is probably the only place you're going to hear and see about real market prices. So the second topic is the IPv4 purchase process. And there are some variations on this in terms of things like payment process, in terms of some of the legal contract wording and so on. But this is pretty much a tried and true approach to purchasing IPv4 addresses. So the first part is really an engineering exercise within your company where someone defines how many IPs do I need, and you go to your finance people and you figure out, what's my budget, how am I going to do this internally from a finance and engineering perspective. Then you come to a broker such as us and you say, okay, I need these IPs, find me a seller that can satisfy my requirement. And that's what we do. We go out and we match the buyers and the sellers together to basically find a match. And once that's done, we bring the 2 parties under NDA, which is my third block along. So the non-disclosure agreement allows the transfer to be treated confidentially. Once everything is under a confidential arrangement, the IPs are reviewed, both from an ownership legal perspective and then also from a technical perspective. Are the IPs clean? Are they blacklisted? Are they blocked at certain mailers? Those kinds of things have to be looked at, because if they're blocked, frankly, they aren't worth very much to the buyer, are they? Next, we would do an asset purchase agreement, which is the legal contract between the buyer and the seller to define the purchase terms. The payment process varies region to region. Many Asia-based buyers want to buy using net 30, net 15, net pay after the transfer approach. The norm in North America is an escrow process, and I'm going to speak to escrow a little bit because I think what's going to happen is as the supply in Asia region dries up, more and more Asian companies are going to need to purchase from America. And what's going to happen is when you buy from America, the American companies are not going to be accustomed to receiving payment after the transfer. And they're going to say to the Asian buyer, we need to pay by escrow. So we're going to have to find some common ground between this desire and norm of paying after the transfer to the North American need to see an escrow payment. So that's something we're going to have to work on between the buyers and the sellers as we go into RIR. Once the transfer is made, which involves the regional internet registries, so it can be through ERA to APNIC, or it can be within APNIC only. If it's a transfer to a Japanese company, it would go from APNIC to JPNIC to the ultimate Japanese company. Those are the kinds of gyrations you have in working through the NICs. Then once it's in the buyer's account, the buyer can announce it on the internet and everything is good. If it is an escrow-based transaction, the funds that have been held in escrow are finally released to the seller. So in other words, the escrow protects the buyer and the seller both, in the sense that the buyer knows he will get paid because the funds are on deposit. So if the transfer goes through, he gets paid. And the buyer is protected in the sense that the funds are on deposit. So if the transfer doesn't get through for some reason, and I've never seen it not get through, then the funds would have been released back to the buyer. So both parties are protected by an escrow arrangement. And the bill of sale is the final step, where the seller will give the buyer an invoice that's marked paid and say, everything's done and good, and here's the amount you paid for your IPs. Just a few comments on the network engineering part of things, because I think we have some technically inclined people in the room. So, what's your rule? Of course, you determine the number of IPs, and then you work with your finance on the budgetary part of the equation. So if you're going to buy a /16 at $7 an IP, you're out there going, 65,000 IPs times $7, I'm going to need a good $440,000 to go make this transaction happen. And you got to convince your finance guys this is the right thing to do. The costs of a transaction, other than the IPs, are the major cost. The other things to consider, really, for the buyer are your ongoing APNIC membership fees. If you're a member of APNIC, you could be a member of JPNIC or regional NICs in Indonesia, Malaysia, or wherever. And then also there is a transfer fee that APNIC applies. Again, if you're not a member of APNIC, then you pay your regional membership fee. So Indonesia, for example, has a very minimal membership fee. The membership transfer fee for the transaction will be much less. So whatever applies to your case. There should not be, in my opinion, the way we do business, any fees charged to the buyer by the broker. In other words, the broker relationship is with the seller. The broker works for the seller selling the IPs. At the same time, the broker wants to have a good relationship with the buyer so that the buyer comes back to the seller, to the buyer every time and has a good relationship. But really, it's the seller who should be paying the broker. You shouldn't be paying finder's fees in general. Sorry, I've got a typo here. I've got right policy considerations, but it's really APNIC policy considerations, a typo on my part. The APNIC pre-approval, as you may know, it's based on 80% need within 2 years. So there is a pre-approval process within the region. And just a few things, as I mentioned, you want to check for blacklisting. You want to make sure that the IPs have not been spammed on. And a good place to do this is senderbase.org. And some sellers and buyers go so far as to allow for IP testing. So that's something you might want to consider, where you can test a couple of /24s out of the IP range that you're buying, so you can make sure that they're clean and will meet your needs. We see this all the time. There is often a geo-ID location issue, especially in a geographic area as large as Asia. So for example, if you have IPs transferred from Hong Kong as the seller to Singapore or Thailand or wherever as the buyer, it often takes up to 2 months for the geolocators to update. So what this means is you put the IPs out to your users as soon as you get them, and they go into Google or whatever your local search engine is, and the web pages that come up are web pages for, say, Hong Kong instead of immediately web pages for Thailand. It takes a couple months for that sort of thing to resolve. And the last thing you want to do in terms of verification is to check the APNIC registry records against the seller records, the seller incorporation records, to ensure that everything lines up and that you're not participating in something fraudulent. And certainly all of the RIRs help with this. APNIC especially make sure that the corporate records match the records in the WHOIS registry. Some negotiation points when you're dealing with a arrangement between a buyer and a seller. So the price depends on the block size. What we see is the larger the block, the lower the price. So if you're buying a /20, you might see $13 an IP, and if you're buying a /16, you might see $7 an IP, and anything in between. The payment method, as I mentioned, the norm in Asia is for payment net so many days, such as pay within 30 days, and the norm in North America is payment via escrow, and the norm in the UK, for example, is payment via a solicitor's account. So as these geographies come together, these payment methods are going to also have to come together, and it's going to be quite interesting. The legal venue for agreements. So this is also interesting because as you have a buyer in one country and a seller in another, you want to have a neutral ground, and often in Asia we see Singapore as the neutral ground choice because of its jurisdiction as an international center for conflict resolution. So often Singapore is chosen. And then there are often warranties in the agreement. A seller will want to put the IPs as is, and the buyer may request some warranties such as, the seller will warrant that the IPs are in the seller's name in the APNIC registry and those kinds of warranties. And the last point is that the contract, as I said, between the buyer and the seller is called an asset purchase agreement. Just a little bit more on the escrow process. I've gone on this a little bit, so I don't want to dwell on it, but I think it's important to educate people on what the escrow process means because of the fact that it is a truly safe way to buy. It protects both the buyer and the seller, and it's something that the finance departments are going to have to get accustomed to. And, as I said, it's a good way to do it, and it's governed by an escrow agreement so that it's legally binding. So some interesting statistics, and these are right out of the APNIC transfer file, which is available online from an FTP site. So just looking, you can see the growth in transfers. And in 2014, we hit almost 4 million IPs transferred. So this is the number of IPs. And to look at the number of IPs per month, you can see it's not consistent growth. It's kind of all over the map. The highest number of IPs was actually in February, and October, November, December was actually a pretty light quarter for whatever reason. And then in terms of block sizes, you can see that the smaller blocks are the most common, 76/24s, 62/23s, and 59/22s. So the smaller blocks are often transferred, but the number of IPs, the sweet spot, the most IPs is in the /16 range, where 1.5 million IPs were transferred. So that has a lot to say in terms of where are the most IPs. And there was only 1/13, 1/14 transfer in the region. Recent prices, I briefly mentioned that the point is that the larger the block, the lower the price. And these are recent prices that my company has seen. And again, this is not really published anywhere. These slides are available online, so if you want to see our data, we also publish it on our website for other regions. You'll find that RIPE prices are a little higher than the prices in APNIC or ARIN. ARIN prices tend to be a little lower than APNIC, and the reason for that is that there's quite a bit larger supply in ARIN region. At least that's my theory. And there's a very tight supply in APNIC region, but I believe prices are lower than RIPE region because of the fact that you can transfer from ARIN right now. So that kind of keeps a cap on the prices here. The prices, as I said, you start at between $7 and $8 for /15s and 16s. And you can see that there's a fairly tight range of prices we observed over the course of the year. When I said a /16 is $7, that's the price you can get it from ARIN region, and it's a little more if you want to try to get one from within APNIC region. There's not very many out there. I'm aware of 4 or 5/16s available in all of APNIC region, so there's not very many. Versus in the US, there's /8s out there where they're selling parts of their /8s. So there's a huge supply in ARIN region. Price trends, I talked briefly at the beginning about the Microsoft transaction, $11.25 per IP, and these are prices only in APNIC region and the direction prices have gone, but you can see the general downward trend. The size of the ball represents the number of IPs traded, and you can see that the bigger clumps of IPs are kind of on the lower side of the line, representing bigger blocks commanding lower prices, but you can still see the downward trend of the line, meaning that as time has gone on, prices have dropped. My last topic is the market outlook, what I think is going to happen this year, and what we're seeing is, as I said, only 4 or 5/16s in all of APNIC region right now. So supply is very tight here, and that supply is going to be supplemented from ARIN region. Someone will snap up those available blocks, but at some point, blocks are going to have to transfer from the other regions, especially ARIN. I think companies are going to be willing to pay a small premium, that $7 to $8 for these APNIC-based blocks. 2 reasons. One is that a lot of the companies are going to want to pay net 30 instead of via escrow. And the second reason is the process of just dealing within your own region. Things like the geolocator, things like only dealing with APNIC and not dealing with ARIN, those make the blocks a little bit more valuable. Last point is that I talked about the difference in prices, that RIPE prices are a little higher than APNIC prices and ARIN being the lowest. Those prices aren't going to harmonize and may never harmonize because of different supply and demand curves in each region, but they aren't going to come closer together until this needs justification issue is common across all regions. So today in RIPE region, you don't have to do needs justification. In ARIN region, you have to prove need, as in APNIC, 2 years, 80% utilization. And once that goes away in all regions, or is common in all regions, that will change because companies don't want to do that if they don't have to. So until we get some common ground amongst the regions, I don't think you'll see common prices. And that is my final slide, and I would be very pleased to take questions.
So this is your last slide. Okay.